The challenge of continuing to use fossil fuels is enormous. We'll need to do it for the next 100 years, but we can't do it the way we're doing at the moment. We must capture as much of the CO2 that we produce from those fossil fuels and store it. The one major mechanism we've got of doing that is to compress it and transport it and store it into a variety of underground reservoirs.
If we're going to store carbon dioxide deep underground, we're talking about billions and billions of tonnes, we need to understand all the processes involved with doing that on an industrial scale. How does the carbon dioxide move underground? How can we ensure that it doesn't escape? What happens to it in the long term? All of these research questions are addressed as part of the Qatar Carbonates and Carbon Storage Research Centre, a 10-year, $70 million programme funded jointly by Qatar Petroleum, Shell and the Qatar Science and Technology Park.
At Shell, obviously, we're really concerned about the future of energy. About half of the world's oil yet to be developed is in those carbonate reservoirs in the Middle East. The use of this research in understanding CO2 and its storage underground in the carbonate reservoirs is really important to address climate change. Using this research to be able to enhance oil recovery from those reservoirs could make a very significant difference to the amount of energy produced.
The Qatar Carbonates and Carbon Storage Research Centre has employed some of the top young academics, PhD students and postdocs, and attracted them to London. So we have a big pool of expertise, but it's very broad. It ranges from geologists who go out to fieldwork, to geochemists who work in the lab, through to physical chemistry experts, through to computational fluid dynamics experts.
In order to understand the rock fluids, you need to understand the pathways that these fluids can take. And the pathways that the fluid take is dictated by the geology. Another concern is if you have fractures. The carbonate rocks are stiff. And because they're stiff, they can essentially break during deformation. And these fractures then can be preferential conduits for fluids. If you understand the geometry of the matrix of the carbonates themselves and the geometry of the fractures, you then have a template in which you can try to understand the flow of fluids in terms of fluid dynamics.
My focus in the QCCSRC project is on fracture-related dolomitization. In the subsurface, we can find these units of dolomite, which are characterized by different permeability characteristics compared to the limestone. So they build up the heterogeneity in the reservoir, which we do need to understand in terms of the storage of CO2 in the subsurface.
Another area of research is to bring in novel tools, new ways of understanding the history of the formation of the reservoirs and how it changes through times in order to be better able to predict where the best reservoir conditions will be. What we have done specifically in my group is work on a tool called clumped isotopes, which allows you to take carbonates, dissolve the carbonates, measure the resulting CO2, and out of this measure, based on thermodynamic principles, to determine the temperature at which the different phases of the reservoirs were formed. And that's very important because it allows us to fingerprint processes within the reservoir, and by combining this with our understanding of the geometry of the reservoir, we can then build predictive models that are useful for carbon capture and storage.
If we understand the rocks, we also need to understand the fluids, the carbon dioxide we inject, the resident brine, within the rock. We have pioneered methods where we can look inside the rock with X-rays to examine both the rock structure and the fluids within them at scales of a micron and upwards to core samples that may be up to a metre long.
We need to know if the kinds of chemical reactions that take place when you inject CO2 underground will affect the flow properties of that fluid, or will affect the integrity of the caprock that's keeping that fluid safely in place. The main focus of our work is an area known as petrophysics, where we're trying to understand how carbon dioxide and brine flow through the rocks and how they react chemically with the rocks once that carbon dioxide is injected underground. We do that primarily through an experimental approach. We make observations of what happens when carbon dioxide is flowing through actual rocks at the conditions of pressure and temperature that we see in the subsurface. So this unique facility combines high-pressure apparatus that allows us to perform those observations in real rock cores at reservoir conditions.
With my research group, we develop experimental techniques to study how CO2 behaves when it's injected into rock samples that are representative of deep geological storage formations. So these rocks are very heterogeneous, so they're very complex, they belong to a natural environment. Our goal specifically is to quantify and understand how these heterogeneities affect the way CO2 distributes and flow into the rocks. We inject a very small amount of radioactive tracer into the rock sample. By using a special technique, we're able to basically detect the movement of the tracer through the rock. And this allows us to quantify how well the CO2 is able to displace the water and to quantify how much CO2 is stored into the rock.
My group specifically looks inside rocks at very small scales, the pore scale, at the micron level, because that's the scale of the little gaps between the solid rock into which we're going to force the CO2 and we want to store it.
I use the micro-CT to do experiments on carbonate cores, and I look at the reaction between CO2 saturated brine, which is acidic, and carbonate rock. And I take three-dimensional tomographies dynamically, so over and over and over again, as we flood this reactive fluid through the rock, and I look at how the rock dissolves and what conditions it dissolves under and how it dissolves under different conditions.
We image the processes that would occur during CO2 storage. We look at what will happen in the long term to ensure safe storage, and we also develop numerical models.
An important aspect of carbon storage is that you're going to inject carbon dioxide in a supercritical state into carbonate reservoirs. Whilst a lot is known about CO2 on its own, not very much is known about the properties of CO2 when you mix it with other fluids.
In carbon storage, the CO2 is injected into a saline aquifer. Once in the aquifer, it can dissolve into the reservoir fluid, and in order to model what happens to the CO2 over long periods of time, you need to know the physical properties of the solution that's formed at high pressure and high temperature in the reservoir as this CO2 dissolves into the reservoir fluids.
When CO2 is injected, it forms an acidic solution, and that will dissolve the minerals of the carbonate reservoir. So this dissolution process is what we're looking at specifically here. And we do that in a reactor system that allows us to separate the effects of the surface reaction from the transport of the reactive species to and from the surface. So that gives us a surface reaction rate free of the influence of mass transfer.
In order to understand the long-term fate of the CO2 in the reservoir, we need to characterize and be able to predict the physical properties of that system, which can exist as two separate phases with carbon dioxide interfaced against brine, or it can exist as a solution after the CO2 has dissolved into the brine. In my laboratory, we're measuring the whole range of physical properties, including the interfacial properties that you get when you have CO2 and brine as separate phases, the solubility of the carbon dioxide in the brine, and properties such as the density and the viscosity of the resulting solutions. We have a high-pressure view cell, which is used for studying the interfacial properties of carbon dioxide and brine.
The view cell is pressurized, and we can heat this up into high temperatures or pressurize it to high pressures, introduce a droplet of brine or water, and measure the interfacial properties of this droplet when we expose it to different atmospheres of carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide with other gas mixtures.
The experimental data that comes from an experiment like this is used in the determination of model parameters.
In my group, we develop theoretical tools that start with an understanding of how molecules interact with each other. We develop analytical expressions that can then predict the macroscopic properties of these complex fluids. It helps validate the experiments, and in return we also validate our models. The work that we do developing theories is critical, for the future of these tools.
We have two ways of disseminating our research, and that's through the academic method, where we go to conferences and present and publish papers, but we also want to package our data up into much more useful tools that help the industry be able to predict what's going on subsurface.
We're already working in Canada and the UK on small pilot scale activities. But if we're really going to address climate change, I think we're going to have to get massive scale, and this project will really help us make that understanding come alive.
By 2050, we've got to capture 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year to meet our requirements to keep the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere down below 450 parts per million. What we've got to do in order to do that is to utilise all the resources we've got to rapidly develop this technology.
The work that we do is allowing us to design safe and effective CO2 storage. If we achieve this, we will be able to move seamlessly and smoothly towards a secure energy future.